Welcome to Retire Smart with David Brooks. I'm Chip Maxwell. Well, David, you are now a Big Red season ticket holder. You were there for the first Matt Rule win. Did you like what you saw?
I did. The energy was amazing at the game. I actually brought in a consultant who'd never been to a Husker game and took him to the game with our tickets, and we had a great time. My wife and I and a couple of guests, and yeah, we upgraded our season tickets this year, so I guess we're in what you call the club level. So there's actually seat backs, which is kind of nice. But I think they built these seats when people are a little smaller, Chip. Your knees are into the person in front of you.
Oh, no.
So hopefully when they do a little revamp there, they space these out a little better in the future. But it was great energy. Pre-game, I mean, you saw there was over 75% of the stands were full, like 45 minutes before the pre-game. People wanted to see.
You got to watch see how the kickers are doing.
Yeah, all
you
the pre-game, the
which
tunnel
quarterback's
walk.
taking the snaps with the first team.
Then they had the drones
business.
out there at the turn when the light thing went out. That was pretty cool. So anyway, just and our defense, hey, defense looks legit all three games. I can tell you, I've watched. So anyway, black shirts are showing up, and our local boy and quarterback looked pretty good. Although I hear they're today or whatever they're going to be starting Jeff Sims. I prefer they would stick with Harburg and give him a chance to get some momentum, but we'll see. But anyway, all in all, yeah, it was really nice to see a pretty good team total performance.
All right, on to our weekly team meeting where you mentioned that bonds are down, the S&P is up, but you said you have to look at something called the blend. What do you mean by the blend?
Well, like when we explain to clients, nobody's going to or shouldn't be, in our opinion, typically in like a 100% stock portfolio. So historically speaking, there's what's called a 60-40 portfolio. In fact, this is taught in CFP curriculum, basically how to have a diversified portfolio. And for a very basic diversification, you're talking about equities or stocks for being typically around 60% of somebody's portfolio, and 40% would be in bonds. And the idea is that bonds are there for defensive mechanism and stocks are there for the offense, if you will, to grow, if we're talking like football. So like last year was one of those years where it just got destroyed. So bonds lost over 15% last year and stocks over 20%. So a 60-40 portfolio lost over 17% last year. Well, this year, bond market is down for the third year, down about 3% or so as of this recording. And stocks, while they were up a little over 15%. That wasn't really the case. If you used an equal-weighted S&P 500, stocks are only up about 4%. And so if you use the regular index, that means the 60-40 was only up about 8%. But if you used an equal-weighted equity portfolio, you'd be lucky to be up about 4% year to date, or even 3% on if you had bonds in there. And so people need to be very realistic in what the market is showing and what the returns probably are. In fact, Delbar has a study out they put out every year where the average investor over the last 20 years has only averaged about 4.8%, even though the indexes show much higher returns. And that's because, one, they're probably have diversification, and two, they make emotional decisions at the wrong time. And what we want people to do, Chip, is not make emotional decisions and pull all their dollars at the wrong time because of panic or headlines, et cetera, whether it's inflation, Fed information on interest rates, et cetera, which we got this week, that kind of stuff. So we want people to make rational decisions with their money. And we focus here on retirement planning, which is typically going to last 24 or so years. So you need your money to be managed over a 2.5 to 3 decade period. And you need to look at it that way. You shouldn't be chasing performance quarter by quarter or even 1 year at a time.
You also said it's somewhat misleading, the market performance, because it's really the top 7 that are carrying the market right now.
Yeah, they've been referred to this year as the Magnificent Seven. That was a good old movie, Yul Brynner, and of course redone, I think, with Denzel Washington, which wasn't a bad version of it either. But the Magnificent Seven, yeah, so the 7 leading tech stocks, this is NVIDIA, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, et cetera. These stocks are up about we're up at their peak. Some of them have fallen here recently, about 60%. Is what they were up. So they were pulling the indices up because they're huge market caps. When if you took them out of the S&P 500, the S&P 493, if you will, left, was only up 3%. So that gives a little dose of reality to folks out there. I'll give you another example. Dollar General. If the economy's doing well, Dollar General's a company that people would typically go buy, just basic needs, et cetera. Not very expensive. That's the whole idea behind it. Dollar General, it's going to be inexpensive items. Their stock is down 50% this year.
Oh.
50%. Okay. So if the economy is really doing that good, how could a stock of a staple retailer be down 50%?
David, I heard you say early in the week at one of your tax presentations, well, the Federal Reserve is not going to nudge interest rates up again, but it should. Is that still your take?
Yeah, because unfortunately, if they really are committed to fighting inflation, they will have to create what we call demand destruction in the economy. And it's going to happen one way or the other. But the longer they prolong this, the longer they take to finish the job off, the more damage is going to be done, and the further the economy will have to fall to get to where they want. This nonsense of engineering a soft landing when it doesn't happen ever is ridiculous. It's ludicrous, but that's what the talking heads do on TV. And unfortunately, some of this is politically driven. And so there's tremendous political pressure. You know, the media won't report this, put on the Federal Reserve not to move interest rates when clearly we see a reacceleration of inflation. And oil prices is one of those areas. Just look at what you're paying for gas again. And wait till you see what you're paying 30 days from now. Mark my words. Oil is going much higher. We crossed over $90 a barrel this week, and I think we're headed to $105 and potentially $120 at some point next year if we don't see any corrective action. So that is creating inflation itself, and so the Fed is actually going to get further behind by pausing as they've done, and this is going to create more pain when it all comes unwound.
The big national economic news now, David, is the auto workers strike. I'm going to hit you with a couple of headlines, both from CNBC. First one is UAW members go on strike at 3 key auto plants after deal deadline passes. So we got nearly 13,000 on strike and potentially 140,000 plus. And then the other headline is striking unions impacting the economy at a level not seen in decades. David, did I get this note right? Did you say this could hit the economy, remove $6 billion a week from the economy?
That is correct.
Explain that to us.
If all 146,000 members of the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, go out on strike, that means vehicle production for basically the big three comes to a halt, right? And the vehicle sales of those big three is basically $6 billion of economic activity. Not just they sell it to the dealership, right? Wholesale the car to the dealership. There's transportation companies get paid to move them from here to there. Then there's salespeople that go out and sell those vehicles, their service to those vehicles. The economic impact of those vehicles not being sold is $6 billion a week when you filter it all the way down to the salesperson taking his commission, going to the grocery store with it and buying his family goods and services, et cetera. So this is a massive economic impact. And that second article talked about how big an impact this is. And the reason is just think of the average price of a new vehicle. It's over $50,000 now. And if you're buying a truck or an SUV, it's over $70,000. That just boggles the mind. My first house was at $93,000. I bought my first house, right? And I used to laugh because people were like, we bought our first house for $15,000. Clients older than me, and they were laughing when I had to spend almost $100,000 on my first house. And this was a nice house in a middle class income neighborhood, et cetera. This is obviously a long time ago, about 30 years ago. But we're seeing the impact, and it's detrimental to our economy. And so this is going to create more uncertainty. And of course, if they give in, then the wage inflation they're asking for, which is a 30 to 40% raise across the board, would further spiral inflation out of control, obviously. And look, I'm not taking sides here. I think unions have a right to negotiate, but 40% raises are not in the cards.
Well, in the meantime, you alluded to this last week, and then we hit this milestone this week. Another CNBC headline, U.S. national debt hits $33 trillion for the first time. David, would you quickly review? I still run into people who say, big deal. That doesn't affect me. That doesn't affect my retirement plan. Ain't necessarily so, David.
No, if you study history, right, you learn from it. Otherwise, you're doomed to repeat it. Well, with $33 trillion in debt, and you understand that's 135% debt to GDP, right? Our GDP is only about $26 trillion. So we are spiraling the wrong direction, and we're running a deficit of 9.8% this year. That's massive. A 10% deficit in your budget when you have a $6 trillion annual budget. Call it a budget. It's a joke, right? So we're adding and fueling to that debt just since our last, and of course, now we're coming against the government shutdown again. Here it is coming up in October 1st. We just went through this in June, right? And they added $1.6 trillion in 60 days. And now they're adding $1 trillion per quarter, Chip. As of right now, at current interest rates, by Thanksgiving next year, it will cost us more than $1 trillion per year just to service the debt, just to pay the interest on it. That's not paying principal. That's just paying the interest on our debt. And right now we have $6.7 trillion of that 33 that has to be refinanced in the next 12 months. In other words, we have maturities at different levels of maturity. We have $6.7 trillion of debt that is getting refinanced right now over the next 12 months, and rates are substantially higher than when those debts were taken out. That is going to add more fuel to the fire. And how do they get that genie back in the bottle? Well, from history, Chip, it means they raise your taxes. And according to the Wharton School of Finance, to the Stanford University, to Jeremy Siegel, there's multiple experts say we have to do a blanket raise in revenue across all tax classes, all brackets of 40%. Or they do give an option, or we can cut our government spending by 30%.
Which one do you think's going to happen? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and people
The
are out
tax
there.
storm is
Well,
coming.
no, they're going to tax the rich, folks. You can confiscate all
the money.
All 900 billionaires in
everybody
America
has.
confiscate 100% of their net worth. Just take their company stock, take it all, and you will run the government for less than 90 days.
You have to hit the middle class if you're going to pursue that policy option. Look, the tax storm is coming. The point is, don't panic. Get the report card. It's complimentary, no charge, no obligation. We'll look at your whole financial situation. Maybe you're in good shape. Maybe you need to make some changes, and we will offer recommendations on what you might want to do next. The complimentary report card, 402-369-7777, 402-369-7777. Up next, digital currency. It's not going away. You need to be informed about it. Stay tuned for the latest developments in digital currency from Retire Smart financial advisor Brad Starken. He joins us next on Retire Smart with David Brooks. Welcome back to Retire Smart with David Brooks. I'm Chip Maxwell. Digital currency, cryptocurrency, digital assets. We explore all this and more with one of our financial advisors at Retire Smart. David, please introduce our special guest.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. So back in studio with me is one of our financial advisors. He's been with us for, it's a year now, basically. Time flies, man, when you get whipped in pickleball. Brad is a competitive person, and so am I. And so the first day of his employment with our firm, we went and played pickleball, and he crushed us all. And so I actually congratulate him at the end of the day. That was the shortest tenure of any employee we've had thus far. No, we're really glad to have you on, and we like your competitive juices. And you were a college athlete, and you played basketball up at Wayne, and so we understand that competitive juice. In fact, I've seen it on the golf course, and someday if I can drive like you, I could probably play golf for a living. Who knows? You could putt like me, maybe you could too, right?
Very true, very true.
Hey, listen, we're gonna dive in today. Brad is actually kind of our local go-to guy on digital assets, digital currency. In fact, he has the only designation that is basically out there in our industry right now. So talk about what it took to get that designation. And I think it was Rick Edelman, who's now retired, who kind of started the Digital Currency Council or whatever it's called, right? So
yes, it's called the Digital Asset Council for Financial Professionals. So I have my DACFP. I had to take some additional classes to get that certificate. But yes, it's all talking about, blockchain technology, Bitcoin, the digital dollar, things of that nature.
So we've got a lot of different angles to talk about when it comes to digital currency and digital assets. So let's just talk about, people's fear, number one, of digital currency. And rightly so. There's some great fear things out there. But I always like to take it back to the basics to get people to kind of open their aha moment of, let's face it, most of our payments, most people, even those that are fearful of this, including my wife, 90% of their transactions or better are digital in nature, i.e. a credit card or a debit card, right?
Absolutely.
In fact, you shared a clip with me. It was a Burger King accepting credit cards way back in 1983.
93.
93. All right.
Yep.
So 30 years ago, they were going to start accepting credit cards, and they went in and filmed like the manager and customers, and people were like, that's stupid. Who would ever use a credit card? Who's going to charge a $3? And they're talking about a $3 meal. And of course, don't we wish we could get a meal for $3 anymore, right? But, and then people were like, I would never do that. And a couple people were like, oh, I'm getting percentage back on my credit card. This is great, And of course, today, it's literally 99% of transactions in fast food restaurants are put on digital cards. Now, there's credit cards and there's debit cards. I want to make sure I always give this advice. Don't ever use your debit card, ever. The only reason you should ever use a debit card is if you need to withdraw cash from an ATM, because there's no guarantees on your debit card, and you make sure you understand that. So if you swipe your debit card even at the gas station and someone put one of those little scammers on there and got your number and they raid your bank account, you have no recourse. Where if you use a credit card companies will protect you from fraudulent behavior on your card, and you won't owe those dollars back. So just put that note in your hip pocket. But so we were using credit cards pretty regularly. How old were you when that commercial was filmed?
I'd have been 5.
Okay, so at least you were here. You know? So it is, and I can tell you from experience. Like, I used to own restaurants. These were mainly like pizza restaurants, calzone wings, etc. And I can tell you, 80% of our take-in every night was cash, good old-fashioned greenbacks, right? The next 15% was personal checks. You know, people actually wrote personal checks, and our average check back then was about $14. So someone would write a check for like $14 and change. And then only about 5% was credit cards. And we took credit cards the last, I think, 4 years that I owned the operation in the late 90s, but it was still very minimal. It wasn't mainstream. It was convenience for some people, but that was back when we still went chink, chink, you know, the old machine where you had to slide it over and have a carbon copy, and then you had to sign every transaction still, even if it was that small. And I remember it wasn't even maybe 10 years ago where if it was under like $25, they no longer required your signature, and people forget how. And of course, today I don't use all these things, speed passes, Apple Pay. I know a lot of people use things like Apple Pay. I don't, but you can just tap your credit card, and I think some might have that feature, but I've never really even used it. I'm still going to insert it in the machine or whatever. But it's funny, as technology grows, right? Innovation comes to payment systems, and there's a lot of irony there. I'm actually currently listening, almost finished up a new biography on Elon Musk, and a lot of the book focuses on his original company X, which is now X is Twitter, right? Or was Twitter, now X. But originally it was his company X merged with PayPal, you know, about 25 years ago, and PayPal was the name that won out. But he wanted a social media company that could do digital payments, which is now what it's coming full circle. He's trying to drive Twitter into that universe now. But so digital payments are everywhere. We're going to talk about digital currencies. You're going to be hosting a class at some point in the first quarter. We'll get that schedule out to you if you want to. Get registered. I'd recommend you get registered now, because that thing will fill up, I imagine, the first time we host it. But I want to talk about digital payments, not Bitcoin today. We talked a little about, you know, cryptocurrencies, et cetera, last time you were on blockchain technology. I want to talk about what the Fed is doing. So I want to talk about 2 key areas, and I'll let you kind of just give your opinion on each. One is Fed Now, which is the Fed's version basically of like a Venmo or a PayPal or a Zelle, right? Payment transaction systems. And we'll talk about why would they want to offer this system to you? Let's think about that, right? and 2, I want to talk about the digital dollar, right? So the central bank has been for years crafting and creating a digital dollar. In fact, they've already started testing it at 12 banks, as far as I know. And you brought an interesting piece in me today, a piece of legislation that is currently in the House of Representatives to maybe prevent them from going further, et cetera. So let's start on the digital dollar. Let's start there on the digital currency. Why was the Federal Reserve trying to create a digital dollar in the first place?
Yeah, so essentially with the digital dollar, they're trying to keep on these digital payments and trying to make things more efficient. But, you know, sometimes that always doesn't happen with the government when that does happen. But it's possibly a little bit around control as well, right? I know we talked about that before.
Because it's basically, this is obviously, if it's digital, it's programmable.
Yes.
Right? So they could, your dollar doesn't work for these certain things. Like, oh, you're buying gas for a car, we're only going to allow you to buy $10 worth of gas because we want you to go use an EV or something. They could force behavior, right?
Absolutely.
Versus incentivize behavior, right? Which I prefer the latter. If you want to get society to do things, you can incentivize them, I understand. But forcing them, you're going to get a lot of pushback, a lot of blowback, right? So people are scared of this digital dollar because we're hearing stories, horror stories from Europe, Sweden in particular, where it's almost like social credits. If we don't like what you're doing, we're going to shut down your use of dollars, right? And people are like, oh, they wouldn't do that. Well, look north of our border in Canada. What happened to the truckers that just decided to peacefully, mind you, peacefully protest the lockdowns they were doing across the province in Canada? Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, and his cohorts, and that is a socialist nation, so you need to understand this, they went in and basically froze them out of their own bank accounts, right? And digitally, they couldn't access their funds. So the fear, I think, out there for people, I understand why it's real, but the reality is this digital dollar is probably coming in some form, at some point in time, and it's going to become mainstream, just like credit cards did from 30 years ago, right?
I would agree with that. Hopefully, that's still another 5 to 10 years out as that'll get more mainstream adopted. But obviously, we're really concerned about what the underlying programmable technology is behind that. I think that's one of my main concerns. Is if we take all the currency that's out there right now, what's them, if this goes all digital, what's them saying, okay, well, now we have another, $10 trillion available in the U.S. market. That's one of my main concerns. But one of the bills that they're looking at this week is for the Digital Dollar Pilot Prevention Act, or H.R. 3712, which would prohibit the Federal Reserve from initiating those pilot programs to get those CBDCs, or those central bank digital currencies, without approval from Congress. So it does have to go through some layers.
Because obviously you could just, if a skilled hacker could create digital dollars in some fashion, I'm imagining there. Now, the interesting thing is we've seen current political representatives running for president, both Democrat and Republican. And I'm referring to Robert Kennedy Jr. and Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida. Both of them are vastly opposed to the digital dollar, right? And they've outspoken about it. I think that article mentions them. So if you're outspoken about it, you might want to look up HR, what is it, 3712, 3713?
3712, correct.
3712, HR 3712. You can Google that if you want to kind of look it up. And then let your representative know, Don Bacon or whoever it may be, whether you are supportive of something like that or want them to take a look at it. But I'd be, aware of what's coming. Now, let's flip real quick in the time we've got left and just talk about FedNow, their payment system. And of course, again, they're saying that this is to create a convenience factor so that you can make payments, and by federal law, what they're trying to do is, at least by the from what I've read on it, they're trying to make it so you could pay payments the day of to anybody, and it would be accepted as legal tender. So 4:59 p.m. you could digitally transfer money through this FedNow program, and your bill has to be considered due, so nobody could charge you a late fee, et cetera. So from that regard, they're like, hey, look, this will help people avoid late fees. There's no transaction fees to it, et cetera. So why would they want to set up a system that's going to cost the taxpayer money if there's no expense to the user?
Yeah, kind of going back to that control again, unfortunately, because we obviously already have all those payments. When you're talking about either Apple Pay, you can send people money on there. You have Venmo, Cash App, even Zelle. I mean, I have that through my bank account where I send it to my family members. It does go in their account that same day. But in this scenario, once again, the Fed wants you to be transacting with them so they know where all your dollars are going.
Yeah, and just so you know, if you're using PayPal and Venmo, places like this, you're now going to, they've paused this for a while, but you're going to get these basically 1099Ks, I think is what they're calling them, but basically you're going to get a documentation showing the money transact. Doesn't mean it's taxable, so I don't want you to freak out, but you are going to have to document these transactions of all sizes, and at the end of the year, you're going to get some kind of report from whatever vendors you've used. And I know I've got one kid that asked me for money on Venmo and another one that asked me money on Cash App, and then my wife makes me pay a couple of things for her on PayPal. I'm like, could you guys just get on one app for me? I mean, but it's the reality. These are things that are here, and I have to admit, look, 5 years ago, I didn't know what Venmo was, right? And one day, one of my employees grabbed me lunch. I run a crazy schedule, and so somebody would just cover my lunch and like, can you give me the $12 I spent for you for lunch? Obviously, it's not the $3 we talked about earlier, right? And I'm like, sure. And they're like, just Venmo me. I'm like, what's that, right? And so I had to learn, and of course now I use it pretty regularly. It is convenient,
yes.
and really convenient if you have kids in other states and you need to send some money. Like I've got one in college in Florida, and hey, Dad, I gotta buy this new book or something, and I need $120. Venmo me, And so that's becoming a verb now. So anyway, really interesting what's happening. So I think that, we're going to have you back and keep explaining where we're going. We'll see where this bill goes and have you report on that the next time you're on here in maybe about 2 months. And then we'll have the class information ready for the next time you're on. But if you want to get pre-registered for that class, because I imagine it will fill up for digital assets, give us a call, 402-369-7777. Brad, this time has flown by. I'm sorry we're out of time for this week. Thank you for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Chip, what do we have up next?
Up next, you have questions. David Brooks has answers. Q&A is next on Retire Smart with David Brooks. Welcome back to Retire Smart with David Brooks. I'm Chip Maxwell. Into the Q&A we go. David, the first question, this came from an attendee at our David Walker event, actually, and it's about job numbers. If 100,000 people retire during a given month and 100,000 recent college graduates are hired for new jobs in that month, is that counted as 100,000 new jobs in that month? It seems to me that the new hires are simply replacing the retirees. That's not an addition of 100,000 new jobs. Does the Bureau of Labor Statistics account for this type of replacement when calculating job growth?
They actually do. So when they report to you, they report net job growth, okay? And if we don't create at least 250,000 jobs a month, we are going backwards because of that very topic. People retiring, slowing down, going part-time, et cetera. And so, yes, but the BLS, and now the problem is the way they calculate their numbers in general is more of an estimate today than an actuarial number like it used to be. And we've talked about this because you can't have tax receipts down 15% year over year, spending up, as we talked about, over 10% a year, and then claim that we have all these new jobs and there's no tax revenue from them. So something smells fishy, so to speak, in the neighborhood.
The number keeps getting retroactively revised each month.
Well, and we just went through our 7th consecutive month of negative job revisions. So after we report the number, we go back and cut it down, and we've been cutting it down by about 100,000 a month, right? The last time we had 7 consecutive negative job revisions was in 2007, and if you have any memory, then the next year or two was not so pretty. And so that usually means that their estimates they're doing estimates based off statistical data, but they haven't quite got the turn yet where companies are like, oh, actually, yeah, we let go 3,000 people. And we're starting to see that. Companies are letting people go. We're starting to see job openings being pulled. So we think you're seeing the labor market turn, and that will really accelerate, especially if the full union thing goes into effect this week and all those unions go out there. You're going to see some deterioration in the job numbers.
Next question is about shrinkflation. I have heard you and others talk about shrinkflation when the price stays the same, but there is less product in the container. I see that some grocery stores are now posting shrinkflation warnings on the shelves to alert shoppers to items priced the same or higher, but offering less product. The idea is to shame companies into stopping this practice. Do you think it will work?
So, I think it's interesting that the supermarket is stepping up and doing this, obviously, because they have to protect their margin on their products, and obviously they have very close relationships with their vendors. And if you don't understand the grocery model, right, so typically you're vying for shelf space, right? When you go to a grocery store, those companies are vying for every square inch of shelf space they can get to put their products on display with you. They don't just automatically get to put it on the shelf. And obviously the more turnover of that product, the grocery store is happy to do it, and the grocery store makes its margin. And most people don't realize just how thin that margin is. A good friend of mine was a manager for years, now retired from Winn-Dixie grocery stores, a big chain in the South that just got recently purchased by Aldi. But they made an average of less than a half a penny from most of his career per item, right? But the idea is they move millions and millions of items a week. And so grocery stores are obviously would like to hold bigger margins, and they typically do. There's loss leaders in the back of the store. We call it the gallon of milk. They usually don't make any money on dairy, right? I mean, it's almost a break even, but they put it, where's the milk at? Because you got to get it, right?
In
the very back of the store, and then you pick up 1 or 2 items that have much higher margins. So this is an interesting concept. The grocery store is trying to be friendly to the customer and say, hey, this package just shrunk. That vendor is probably going to then squeeze that that guy on the margin. But I think it's pretty cool they're doing this. But you should be aware of this fact. We did this on the TV show not long ago, where I actually just pulled out a bag of chips and showed the literal difference of a name brand set of chips and how different the packaging has changed just in the last 3 years. But so yeah, pay attention, because shrinkflation is very, very real.
Here's a question, David, about retirement planning. I saw a story in the Wall Street Journal about a money date for couples planning their financial future. I'm not sure I could sell my wife on the date aspect of it, but do your clients do anything like this? Can a special environment help the planning process? Well, David, Mary Poppins said a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Does a glass of wine help the retirement planning proceed harmoniously?
Well, as I always tell any young couples like at my church before they get married, they need to make sure they're on board with each other. Obviously, spiritually, they need to make sure they have the same belief system. If you really want a long-term marriage to work, in my humble opinion, you need to be on the same page there. But financially, it's very different. Most couples, there's, the old adage, opposites attract, right, is a very real reality. My wife Melissa and I have some very different traits, but when it comes to finances, we made the commitment early. We just committed to each other on finances. My paycheck is her paycheck and vice versa. And there's been times when I carried the load, and there's been times early in the career where she carried the load and was the heavy lifter for our budgeting, et cetera. But we've always been all in. Now, I've met with many couples over the years that have kept their checkbooks separate since day one. And if that's your cup of tea, I understand that. But when you're dating, this is an interesting concept, because it sounds like, man, that would, obviously I haven't dated anybody in a long, long time. I'm married for over 30 years. And I can't imagine on second date, all right, Chip, tonight's going to be the financial date. So we're going to sit down and go through this budgetary exercise. What's your feeling on Roth IRAs? How much are you putting into your 401k, et cetera? But the University of Michigan did a study on this, and they tracked people, and they found the science backs it up. So, maybe it's not the worst idea. Again, I'm the last guy to ask about anything when it comes to dating. I wouldn't know anything to do with it. But I think it's an interesting concept. But I do believe it sparks a larger picture, Chip. Couples need to be on the same page financially, especially when they're about to walk into retirement.
Well, see, the story's also talking about married couples, and now here they're approaching retirement. Well, maybe a little candlelight and a bottle of wine will help us sort this out.
Well, here's the reality. We have a lot of couples that come in where there's one person who's kind of been the person that handled the finances. This is very common. It's kind of one person takes it over in each household. But the other person doesn't know anything. And even if you're what we call a DIY or a do-it-yourself, or you like investing, or you like picking these Vanguard funds, and you're like, oh, I could never pay anybody, we always ask the spouse, well, can you handle this if this person's gone? No. So I always ask them, well, do you at least want to choose who may help your significant other if you were no longer here? And that's a reason for a lot of folks to get help. But what we find with the do-it-yourselfer, Chip, is they have very little tax experience on tax planning and some of the things we do uniquely. They're only talking about one piece of 5, and that's the investments. And so we want people to understand, when it comes to retirement planning, there are 5 key areas. That's what our SMART plan covers, SMART. You got to understand what sources of income you're going to have, how you're going to pay for your medical and healthcare related expenses. By the way, it's over $300,000 per retiree, according to Fidelity now, out of pocket in retirement. So how are you going to pay for that? What type of insurance products could you put in place to mitigate or reduce that, et cetera? We're going to talk about A, which is advanced financial planning, legacy planning. If you have asset transfers, you have appreciated assets you would like to dispose of or pass on to your loved ones. Do you understand the most efficient way to do that? Wills, trusts, power of attorneys, all that's covered. R is for risk mitigation. Do you understand what types of risk you're taking? Not just market risk, but opportunity risk, interest rate risk, inflation risk, et cetera. And of course, my favorite key area myself is T, tax efficient planning, the area most folks miss. So I would just say to folks out there, you need to plan. So whether it's going on a date and having a glass of wine, or hiring an independent fiduciary-based advisor to help you come up with a plan that everybody can agree is their plan. And like I said, my wife and I, we couldn't be further apart, Chip, on things like risk. I like to take it. My wife doesn't like any of it. So we want to build a plan that everybody's happy with, and that's what the SMART plan does. And if you'd like to ask questions about this, Chip, we've got 7 openings for a 15-minute phone call this week with a licensed advisor where you can ask your most pressing question.
Dip a toe in the water. Start the conversation. Call us at 402-369-7777 to schedule a 15-minute complimentary conference with one of our licensed advisors. No charge, no obligation. 7 openings this week. 402-369-7777. Up next, The Tax Foundation published a list of the states with the highest property taxes. Listeners on both sides of the Missouri River, brace yourselves. We'll look at the top 10 high property tax states next on Retire Smart with David Brooks. Welcome back to Retire Smart with David Brooks. I'm Chip Maxwell. Well, David, here's the CNBC headline. These are the U.S. states with the highest property taxes. New York and California are not in the top 10. David, there were two a little closer to home that were in the top 10. One of them is home. Go ahead, David. Give us the bad news.
Yeah, so Nebraska came in at number 7 nationwide as the 7th highest property tax state in the country, and Iowa across the river there came in at number 10. So unfortunately, both made the top 10 on a list we'd prefer not to be on. So our average property tax rate here is just under 1.7% and about 1.5% for Iowa. The highest, was New Jersey at 2.25%, basically, followed by Illinois over 2% and New Hampshire just under 2%. So it could be worse. I guess that's the good news. Now, just so you know, Texas, a state we talk about economically as well, because they don't have an income tax, they're slightly higher than us. They were at 1.68, just a few 100 basis points higher than us. However, Texas, charging the high property tax, Chip, does not impose the income tax, which we still, of course, charge. And the good news is our income tax is going to be lower in a couple of years here in Nebraska. But we need to make better progress on the property tax, because the problem is you start to force retirees, folks we deal with every day, out of the state, because you're going to tax them right out of their home if you continue to run these type of rates. I've talked about already. I am on trajectory. I bought my home for about $330-some thousand 4 years ago. And I am on pace right now to repurchase the home through property taxes in 14 years at the current rate I'm being taxed on my home. Now, It's gone up in value and all that, et cetera. But that's insane. That's absolutely insane. We should cap the property tax at 1%, in my opinion, and it should be on what you paid for it. And so therefore, it would take 100 years for them to collect that dollar. And if they can't run the government on it, then so be it. Cut expenses. Cut your budget like everybody else is going to have to in the coming recession, because I don't believe they're going to lower your millage rate, simply because there's a recession. And boy, they probably won't lower your valuation much either, or if anything.
Yeah. But David, there was more bad news for Nebraska. You flagged this story in the Omaha World Herald. Census data shows steep drop in Nebraska income. Omaha Metro held steady. David, this has been going on for decades, for generations here, this drain out of the rural areas to the I-80 corridor and then eastward to Lincoln in Omaha. Is there a way to counteract that?
Well, I mean, it's difficult when you have such little industry out in the agriculture areas. Let's face it, in Nebraska, we only have 1.9 million people, and the bulk of that is going to be in the Omaha metro or Lincoln area. And then we have just a handful of cities like Norfolk, Columbia, Kearney, Grand Island, et cetera, that even get into the double digits or 5-digit population growth or counts. So all these rural counties, over 60 of them that just barely have a few hundred or a few thousand people in them, suffer drastically, and the drawdowns when things get rough are pretty ugly there, and there's not much anticipation of growth. And when you have companies like Cabela's that pulled out of Sidney, Nebraska, et cetera, these things, they hurt the economy there. And when we go through these downturns in the economy with COVID, this is what happened. Now, I found it interesting on Twitter, or now X, I guess, the Democratic cohorts in our legislature here, and the usual suspects, and again, not get political here, but they started, all of them put in the same article, reposting with the same kind of language, somehow trying to blame this on the Republican legislature that this happened, when this was a phenomenon from inflationary pressures on the cost of living from a Democratic-led president, I might mind you. So again, I thought it was interesting, but the problem here is that we do not have enough diversity of economic activity in the rural areas. And so when you have an industry go south for a little while, you're going to suffer, which is why Omaha does so well, though, because of the diversity of industry we have here within our city. For the pending recession, I think we'll fare better than a lot of cities in the country.
David, you know that I am a fan of the New York Yankees, but you are the one who flagged this story and sent it to me. The headline from Fox Business is, "Ex-Yankees great hurls fastball at Nike. Bud, for putting really big damper on sports, screwed up big time." This is David Wells, David Boomer Wells, a jovial left-hander who is not, known as a fussy, prissy guy, but apparently he's a bit of a liberty guy. He said, hey, and he caught a little flack for it. He actually used some tape to cover up a Nike logo on his jersey at the Old Timers game every year at Yankee Stadium. It was a few weeks ago for this year. And what do you think, David? Was he getting out over his skis here by talking about this?
Well, I mean, he was just talking about something a lot of people are talking about. He mentioned Riley Gaines, who we supported here, giving a speech here a couple of weeks back, an event. He's talked about companies that kind of push this. Obviously, Bud Light he mentioned in the interview with the Dylan Mulvaney controversy there. And he's just saying, companies, stop trying to put your politics out there. He wasn't saying, oh, you need to go the other way. He was like, just stop putting these big brands are trying to force cultural change and let society do that. Sell your product and keep your mouth shut was his general message. And he was on Fox Business with Maria Bartiromo and basically was just talking about people are getting tired of it. Now, what he was calling for is he wants more athletes to step up and speak out so that these brands get awareness of the athletes they sign instead of them being, puppets or talking with the regime. Because some of these contracts, these personal endorsement contracts come with, they have to go say from the pulpit what they're told to say. Mm-hmm. And I don't think a lot of these athletes realize when they sign the deal, their agent gets them a deal, that you have to go stand, you have to go support this, you have to do things, and more pushing back. And he's not the only one out there. The great Boston pitcher, Kurt
Schilling.
Kurt Schilling. Basically, it has a pretty much the same messaging in it, and he lost financially big time for stepping out and speaking out. So what they're asking is some of these younger athletes that have these amazing guaranteed contracts, and they are amazing, some of these guys, $30, $40, $50 million guaranteed every year, whether they play or not, get injured or not, to use their pulpit to just not to take a position, tell the companies, stop messaging us.
More of a libertarian approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would concur with that. I mean, look, Disney World's supposed to be the friendliest place on earth, and it's supposed to be this amazing place that you go take your kids. But I mean, I've talked about my family won't step foot on Disney's doors now, and they were lifers at Disney, season pass holders every year in Central Florida, and it's because they just don't want to hear the messaging. They don't care what you think. Just put the product out and be quiet. So, and I concur with that. So anyway, we'll see what happens.
Final story this week, David, is from Zero Hedge. Los Angeles spends $44,000 per temporary tent for homeless village. I thought maybe, is this The Onion? Is this the Babylon Bee? No. Tell us about it, David.
Well, I saw the pictures of this. It looked like almost like a COVID operation. They put up a base foundation, then they put up this tent with super tie downs, like a hurricane's going to come by, at an expense of $44,000 a tent. So they're taking people from their nasty tent into this really pretty tent, but they're not helping the person get off the street. There's no job offer. They're just blowing money. And we've seen the city of San Francisco now spend over $1 billion to combat homelessness. You'd be better off walking out and handing $10,000 per homeless person. You'd spend less money. It's absolutely ridiculous the way that they're trying to go about fixing these problems, and they're making the problem worse. And yet, you're going to probably see pretty soon the head of all this, the governor of California, is probably going to end up in a presidential race before it's all said and done. Look what I want to do for the rest of you, And again, I try to leave the politics out, but I mean, this is just fiscal insanity. And, I actually am traveling this week to California and going out there. And the last time I was out there, I described what I saw, and I can only imagine what I'm going to see this trip. So
you're heading to the San Francisco area. Well, I recommend you stay in a hotel, not in one of these tents, David. I don't think Melissa's going to settle for that either. All right. Listen, friends, don't end up in a tent. All right. We have to be careful with compliance. We can't promise you the sun and the moon and the stars, but I think we can promise you we can keep you out of a tent if you'll work with us. The first step is the tax guide that you hear offered during the show. Now, David says we've got 7 openings this week for a 15-minute phone conference. If you'd like to dip your toe in the water, start the conversation about your retirement. 402-369-7777. Give us a call, and we'll schedule an appointment. We've got a whole team, David. We have 10 licensed financial advisors on staff. We'll hook you up with somebody to start that conversation. If you want to take the plunge, get the report card, the comprehensive review of your situation, including recommendations on what you might want to do going forward. 402 402-369-7777 for any or all of those. 402-369-7777. David, bring us home.
Have a blessed and prosperous week. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Retire Smart with David Brooks. I'm Chip Maxwell. For David Brooks and the entire team at Retire Smart, have a great week.